In recent years, podcasts and other news media have begun to reevaluate and deconstruct the satanic panic, a bout of mass hysteria that afflicted the United States for over a decade. But what if it wasn't just hysteria? What if some of it was true? Ritual Rewind brings you into the darkest corners of the 1980s, uncovering the crimes, conspiracies, and occult fears that shaped a generation. Tonight, we delve into the Fall River murders. It's a tale of sex, jealousy, and ritual murder. It's the case of the devil and Satan's Avenger, and I'm your host, Drew, and this is the Ritual Rewind. In the bitter cold of a New England winter, 3 women were found murdered. 2 of them had their wrists bound and ankles tied, their skulls smashed in. Lacerations on their body indicated a ritual killing. For the 3rd woman, only part of her skull was ever found. Rumors swirled in the Massachusetts town of Fall River that a satanic cult made up of pimps and prostitutes routinely sacrificed victims on the full moon of every month. Fall River had had a history of violence before. One of its most famous killings was the brutal axe murder of a husband and wife. We've all heard the children's nursery rhyme.
Lizzie Borden took an axe. She gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41.
On August 4th, 1892, Lizzie Borden's parents were brutally murdered with a hatchet. Though there were no eyewitnesses, one bystander came to the house shortly after the murders and claimed to have heard Lizzie laughing at the top of the stairs. The crime would be sensationalized in the headlines and capture the attention of a nation. But Lizzie Borden would ultimately be acquitted of the crime after a similar axe murder happened in Fall River just days before her trial began. And almost 90 years would pass before another series of horrific murders and sensationalized headlines would captivate the town of Fall River.
Good evening. The U.S. Embassy in Tehran has been invaded and occupied by Iranian students. The Americans inside have been taken prisoner, and according to a student spokesman, will be held as hostages until the deposed Shah is returned from the United States, where he's receiving medical treatment for cancer.
It was at the tail end of 1979. The Iran hostage crisis had just begun. China instituted the one-child policy. The television miniseries Salem's Lot was released. My Sharona by the Knack was the #1 song of the year. And on the morning of October 13th, 1979, the body of a young woman was discovered under the bleachers of a Fall River high school. She was stripped down to only her blouse. Her ankles and wrists were bound by fishing line and twine, and her skull was crushed in by multiple blows from a blunt object. And investigators believe that the crime scene had been a ritual killing with elements of torture and stoning. The young girl's name was Doreen Levesque, and she was 17 years old. Levesque had spent the last year under the care of the state's Child in Need Services program and had recently run away from her New Bedford foster home to become a sex worker in Fall River. Shortly before her death, Levesque had penned a letter in her diary to Jesus. She wrote, "Dear Jesus, thank you for everything you've done for me and anything you might do. Someday I would like to be with you in heaven. If I have trouble following you, I'd like for you to help me." Detectives Alan Sylvia and Tom Joachim were assigned to the case. They would soon receive a call from Andre Maltese, who claimed to have knowledge of the Levesque murder. Maltese was well known to the detectives. At 40 years old, he was a convicted pedophile, but was also a self-proclaimed reformed Satanist who had found God. And when he met with the detectives, he brought with him his Bible. But as the detectives spoke with Maltese, he changed his story. He didn't know anything about the murder, not directly, but he knew 2 people that did. Karen Marsden, who was 20, and Robin Murphy, who was 17.
Robin Murphy had a rough and storied past. Neglected by both parents, she had to toughen herself up on the streets. Many considered her overly violent and aggressive, and she could make grown men run from her.
Karen Marsden was the exact opposite. She was described as a good kid with a good heart who had fallen on rough times. And as a mother of a 3-year-old who had been placed into foster care, she was just trying to get by and regain custody of her son. Both Robin Murphy and Karen Marsden first met Maltese when they were underage. Both were groomed and sexually assaulted by Maltese for years. The detectives brought the 2 women in for questioning, and while Murphy was defiant, Marsden was easier to break. She crumbled under the intense pressure and named Carl Drew as Levesque's murderer. Carl Drew was already known by the police. He had been arrested multiple times for assault and robbery, and he worked as a pimp on Bedford Street, where he forcibly recruited young women like Levesque and Marsden to work for him as prostitutes. Rumors abounded about Carl Drew. He supposedly called himself the son of Satan and had tattoos of the Dark Lord on his chest and arm, one of which read, Satan's Avenger. He kept his girls in line by threatening that Satan would take his toll, and he often took them to the Freetown State Forest to hold weekly rituals. There, the girls would speak in tongues and sacrifice goats and cats. They would tie each other to a tree in a mock crucifixion, and one story even had them hang a guy up and stick a baseball bat up his rectum. Freetown State Park has its own dark history of the paranormal and occult, and is part of the Bridgewater Triangle, which connects Abington, Rehoboth, and Freetown. Within the triangle, there have been an overwhelming number of paranormal sightings, including reports of hauntings, UFOs, and cryptid creatures. But among the more concrete, there have been numerous murders and body dumps that have contributed to the location's storied history. As the detectives continued to grill Marsden, the fear of Carl Drew must have gotten to her because she suddenly clammed up. And even with the offer of witness protection, she refused to talk any further and left with Murphy and Maltese. Shortly after speaking with the investigators, Marsden went into hiding, but that didn't stop her from making numerous phone calls to the police over the following months about Levesque and her own fear of Carl Drew. Each subsequent call became more and more unhinged, and she continued to refuse the repeated offers of protection from the police. Her increased anxiety might have been because Carl Drew was looking for her, having made several inquiries into her whereabouts, asking if she or anyone else had been talking to the police about Doreen Levesque. On January 26, 1980, the body of another young woman was discovered in a field. Like Levesque, her wrist had been bound and her skull crushed. She had seemingly been out in the freezing cold and snow for so long their skin had blackened. Further inspection by the medical examiner would reveal that she had been raped and there were teeth marks in her skin. The body was identified as 22-year-old Barbara Raposa, and she had been reported missing in November by her supposed boyfriend, Andre Maltese. And as detectives would soon learn, like with Murphy and Marsden, Maltese had started grooming Raposa when she was just 15 years old. And when he was brought in for questioning, Maltese told detectives that he believed Raposa's murder was related to a cult of devil worshippers that controlled the local sex trade and took orders from Satan. He, of course, was referring to Carl Drew and his group of prostitutes. Maltese claimed to have had a psychic vision of Raposa's murder, and in his vision, one that he believed was given to him by God, showed him floating high in the sky, looking down at a man in a leather jacket. Maltese said that he saw a man beating someone with a rock. That someone must have been Raposa. As she was struck over and over, she called out to Maltese for help, but he was unable to do anything. Maltese ended his statement by saying, "The devil got the best of her, and I hope she goes to heaven." The detectives then asked Maltese who was the man in the leather jacket. Maltese said he didn't know, that he couldn't see his face. They then placed an aerial photograph of the field in which Raposa's body was found and asked Maltese to mark the location of where he was floating above. Maltese indicated the exact spot where Raposa's body was found, though he claimed to never have been there before. Maltese just became the detective's #1 suspect. On January 30th, 4 days after the discovery of Raposa's body, the detectives received a phone call from a woman named Carol Fletcher. She told them that she had a friend who had information on the murder. That friend was Karen Marsden. Marsden again was reluctant to speak with the police and bounced between fits of rage and melancholy. She was worried that Carl Drew would kill her and her son if she talked. She spoke often of the devil, which the detectives assumed was Carl Drew. According to Marsden, Carl Drew held weekly satanic meetings in the Freetown State Park. At these meetings, there was a lot of chanting and speaking in tongues, and she said sometimes even the devil would come and possess someone. She also said that Drew had threatened to inject battery acid into the girls' veins and offer their souls to Satan if they ever betrayed him. The detectives requested for Fletcher and Marsden to take them to the location, but it was at night, and after driving for a few hours, they were lost and returned to Fall River. On February 8, 1980, the police arrested Maltese for the murder of Barbara Raposa, and again, they received another call from Karen Marsden. She wanted to meet, but she didn't want to come to the police station. Instead, she wanted the police to pick her up, and they did. They again offered her protection, and again, she refused, stating ominously, "I'm about to die." She asked to be taken to a church so she could speak to a priest, and the detectives dropped her off at St. Mary's Church. It would be the last time that they would see her alive. The following day, her grandmother would report her missing. On February 9th, 2 weeks after the discovery of Raposa's body, and on the same day Marsden was reported missing, Robin Murphy made a call to the police. She wanted to meet. The detectives went to visit Murphy, who was staying at a friend's house, and the first thing they noticed was the giant mural of Satan painted on the wall. The second thing they noticed was that Murphy was sprawled out, drunk, and high on drugs. When they walked in, she sat up abruptly and blurted out that she couldn't take it anymore and she needed to get something off her chest. She told them that she was present when Maltese killed Barbara Raposa. According to Murphy, on November 7th, 1979, she was riding in the car with Maltese when he told her that he planned to kill Raposa because she was seeing someone else. Murphy then said that they picked up Raposa and a fight broke out when Raposa hit her in the face. During the fight, Robin admitted to biting Barbara somewhere on her breast. Maltese stopped the car and dragged Raposa out. He forced her to strip and lie down on her stomach. Murphy says she watched as Maltese punched Raposa multiple times and then struck her in the back of the head with a heavy rock. He then left her to crawl away into the woods before driving off with Murphy. Murphy said she received a call from him the next day asking where Raposa was, and Murphy told him she didn't know. When asked why she hadn't talked to them before, she said she was afraid of Carl Drew. The detectives then asked her when was the last time she had seen Marsden. Murphy said Friday. They had gone to visit Marsden's son at the foster home. The detectives then asked if she knew what happened to her, and Murphy shrugged. She said she must be dead, that it wasn't like Marsden to do this. She would never be away from her son for that long. After speaking with Murphy, the detectives drove down to Bedford Street and picked up Carl Drew outside of a bar. They wanted to know when he had last seen Marsden, and he said it was Friday night on Bedford Street. She was with Carol Fletcher and Robin Murphy, and he hadn't seen her since. As they questioned him, the detectives couldn't help but notice the tattoos of Satan on his chest and on his arm. When asked about it, Drew replied, "I worship Satan, like you worship God." On April 13th, 1980, a portion of a human skull was found in the woods near Westport, Massachusetts. A second search of the area yielded various items of clothing, blood-stained rocks, jewelry, and even a clump of hair, but nothing more of Marsden's body was ever found. Following this discovery, the detectives picked up Murphy for further questioning, and she began to talk. She said that Karen Marsden was murdered by Carl Drew because she wanted to leave the cult and was a witness to Doreen Levesque's murder. Murphy claimed that she and Drew picked up Levesque from Bedford Street. Drew had wanted to know who Levesque was working for, and Levesque said she worked for herself. Drew slapped her hard enough to make her bleed and demanded that she worked for him. She told him she wouldn't. This enraged Drew, and he drove them to the bleachers at the high school. Drew then dragged Doreen out of the car and into the darkness. Murphy said she couldn't see what happened, but Drew was gone for 10 minutes and came back without Levesque. It was only after it was reported in the papers that Murphy knew that Levesque had been killed. They then asked her about the murder of Karen Marsden. On the evening of February 8th, 1980, Marsden, Carol Fletcher, and Murphy were riding in Fletcher's car along Bedford Street when they picked up Carl Drew. Drew told Fletcher to drive to Westport. He then turned to Marsden and said, "You've been talking too much." Marsden replied that she wasn't afraid of Satan and she wasn't afraid of him either, that God was going to protect her. For which Drew replied, "God can't help you. The only one here is Satan." When they arrived at Devil Pond, Drew ordered Murphy to drag Marsden from the car. Murphy grabbed her by her hair and pulled her out. Marsden pleaded with Fletcher, "Don't let anything happen to my son." Once out of the car, Marsden tried to run, but Murphy chased her down and dragged her back. Drew then told Marsden, "I warned you."
Satan would have his toll.
They stripped off Marsden's clothes and began to stone her. Drew commanded Murphy to slit Marsden's throat while he pulled Marsden's head from her body. Murphy said that Drew then forced her to perform oral sex on Marsden while he played soccer with her head. Finally, Drew knelt beside Marsden and cut an X in her chest. He marked Murphy's forehead with Marsden's blood and said,
"Now you're one of us."
They then poured gasoline on the body and lit it on fire. Murphy went on to claim that the cult killed every 30 days or so on the full moon. They used torture to force the victim to a maximum state of emotional arousal, which they believed resulted in an especially potent sacrifice. On May 9, 1980, Carl Drew was indicted for the murder of Karen Marsden. Drew denied his involvement and said that Murphy and he were rival pimps and that the whole cult thing was set up by Murphy. On Friday the 13th, in March 1981, the trial ended and the jury went into deliberations. And on that very same day, the jury returned its verdict. Carl Drew was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Andre Maltese was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for Barbara Raposa's murder, and he died there. Murphy took a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Drew and Maltese and admitting to killing Marsden. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. No one was ever prosecuted for Doreen Levesque's murder. Only a few years passed before Robin Murphy began to recant her story, and she ultimately told the parole board that she had lied during the trials of Drew and Maltese because she felt Drew was a danger to society and because Maltese had abused her as a child and deserved what he had gotten. I really wanted Drew to not hurt anyone else. If it meant going to jail, okay, I didn't care about me. She ultimately described her false testimony as a suicide mission, and she didn't fully consider the impact her confession would have. Murphy was released on parole in 2004, but after a parole violation for possession of heroin, she was returned to prison in 2011. She appeared before the parole board once again in 2017, but this time she was denied. The members of the parole board called Murphy cunning and manipulative and were dismissive of her account, which had changed numerous times throughout the years. They stated that she had a serious problem with credibility. Robin Murphy was finally granted parole in 2024 and continues to maintain her innocence. She was 61 years upon her release. In 2021, a 4-part documentary was released by MGM Plus on Amazon Prime. It re-examines the murders of Levesque, Raposa, and Marsden, and takes the position that Carl Drew is innocent and was framed by Robin Murphy and some overzealous cops who took the tale of ritual sacrifice at face value without hesitation. In August 2025, Carl Drew was granted access by the courts to review previously protected documents that his lawyers described as information that could prove his innocence. In researching this episode, we relied on numerous news articles, websites, and court documents, as well as the book Mortal Remains, a true story of ritual murder by Henry Scamell. Thank you for joining us tonight on the Ritual Rewind. And as always, please leave a review, tell a friend, and subscribe. You can interact with us at The Ritual Rewind on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And since we are a podcast about when cassette culture met cult culture, stay tuned after this short break for this week's movie pairing. Welcome to our weekly movie recommendation. This week's film is the 2019 horror flick We Summon the Darkness, starring Alexandria Daddario. It takes place in the summer of 1988 in the Midwest Bible Belt, where a rash of ritual murders has taken place. The film opens on the fire and brimstone preaching of a televangelist played by Johnny Knoxville, warning that Satanism is taking over the country. We then come across a group of 3 young women traveling along a rural road to a heavy metal concert hidden in the farmlands of Indiana, when they are overtaken by a van and one occupant throws a milkshake at their car and speeds off. When the women arrive at the concert, they find the same van in the parking lot. There's a confrontation that leads to flirting, which in turn leads to the group agreeing to hang out later after the concert. Revealing too much more of the plot after this would likely spoil the mid-plot twist in the final act. But suffice to say that while this film does not break any new ground, it's a breezy and enjoyable 90-minute romp that you're unlikely to regret. And while its connection to this week's true crime tale is tangential at best, there was a line of dialogue that I think applies to this story, in many cases wrapped up in the satanic panic. It doesn't matter if it's true, it only matters if people believe it. So thank you for joining us tonight on The Ritual Rewind, and good night.